Hey, welcome to class, week 6. Guys, turn of the century literature. And you know what week 6 means? Of a 12-week semester, week 6 means you have made it halfway through. Yes, congratulations! This is the midway point of our course. And fittingly, we're studying turn of the century literature. So we are marking transitionalism or our transition in our own class from the first half to the second half. And it's a similar transition in our literature that we're studying, where we are moving kind of from the older literature to the more modern literature. And that's what marks often that turn from the 1800s to the 1900s. We're going from the olden days, quote unquote, where there weren't as many inventions, to all of a sudden modern times where inventions just take off, right? And just completely revise our lives. I mean, look at where we are now, where we can carry like this little device in our pockets, right? And have like an entire encyclopedia and the contents of a computer right there with us at all times, or even a little tiny watch, right? That can do the same thing. So we're really, embarking on that time period. We're moving from that old time period where there wasn't a lot of mechanization, right? Like industrialization started, um, you know, a little bit in the 1700s and hit much more of a heyday in the 1800s. But then from the 1800s on, woof, we just take off, right? So anyway, yeah, we're at that highly transitional point from the non-modern literature to the modern literature. And as such, we are at a turning point in our class. We're moving from the first half to the second half. And with that kind of time point in our class comes the midterm essay. Yes, you will be writing a midterm essay this week. The assignment you can find in the week 6 folder. I've attached it to the Dropbox, but it's also found, I also put it there as its own file so you don't miss it. So you can open up that assignment and read through it so you know the parameters of the assignment and all the requirements. So good luck on that. You're to write on one work, right, that we've already studied before this point in class, and use a historical perspective to analyze that work, kind of like what we've been doing all this time in class, right? Where we take we learn about what history is going on at the time period, both in the author's life and in the world surrounding the author, and we use that lens or that perspective to analyze the literature and glean more meaning from it. So that's what you're going to be writing your paper on. So good luck, guys. And I have a forum that's on the midterm essay with some sample papers posted from students in the past. So you can read through those if you'd like to get a better idea of how to write the midterm essay, how to write that analysis of a literary work from a historical perspective. And also there's that same forum with those samples. You can post any questions you have about the midterm essay. So feel free to ask. Fellow students may engage in a dialogue with you there, and I also can reply to your questions. So that's a great place for us to share our thoughts and our questions and share information. So good luck with that. Also, I'm always just an email away. I can't wait to read your essays. I'm excited to hear your thoughts because these are some great works. So it'll be really fun to hear more in depthly what you think about them. All right, so moving on to turn of the century literature. All right, well, as I mentioned before, we're turning from the 1800s to the 1900s. So it's that transitional time period on either side of those two centuries. So that's the 19th century into the 20th century. Kind of like what we think olden times into modern times, right? So turn of the century times and literature were highly transitional. And in fact, our anthology presents several themes to discuss this time period in. And those themes are transitionalism, industrialization, the rise and fall of the empire, the death of God, and images of women during this time period. So, and then I have some literary terms at the end of the lecture that were popular trends in literature from this time period. So good terms to know. All right, so let's look at this time period and the literature through the themes that the anthology sets out. The first of which is transitionalism. And that's just a big fancy word to say we are transitioning from one time to another. So it's a big, lots of shifts are happening in society, right? We are transitioning from so many things. And turn of the century times and literature were highly transitional, perhaps appropriate to such a shift in the century. There's always that kind of zeitgeist or spirit of the ages that's going on, when you're turning from one century to another. I don't know if you remember or if you were alive when we turned from, say, the 1900s into the 2000s. But I remember there was the whole Y2K scare and a lot of energy and nervousness, but excitement also about turning from not only the 1900s into the 2000s, right? But from one millennium into another. Yeah, so that was an exciting time period for us too. And likewise, these people of this time period are going through a similar zeitgeist or excitement as they move from the 1800s to the 1900s, a very new century. So we're returning from what many would consider the olden days of the 19th century to the modernity of the modernness, in other words, of the 20th century or modern times. One of the most interesting characteristics of this time period is its sheer plurality of philosophy, psychology, literary theme and style, art form, social mores, that means like social custom, value or values, taste, technology, discovery, and life circumstance. There's so much invention going on at this time period. Industrialization, they kind of started in the 1700s or some, like the sewing machine, things like that, where the steam engine was starting to get invented. Actually, I think the sewing machine was Eli Whitney. And man, I don't want to throw you off, but Eli Whitney invented the sewing machine. That's just one example. What year was that? I'm looking it up really quickly because I don't want to give you the wrong. Oh wait, no, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. What am I saying? It was Singer invented the sewing machine. Okay, yes. He invented it in, let's see, 1794. So we had some stuff going on then in 1794. Right? So that's the end of the 1700s. So then industrialization really starts to take off in the 1800s. And then from the 1800s, once we hit the 1900s, woo! Really, we have gone light years, so to speak, ahead of that time, where we even have, these tiny little devices now in our pockets, or even watches on our wrists that carry like an entire encyclopedia and all of the knowledge on the internet right there at our easy access, at our beck and call. We can call people, we can email people. There are so many apps out there. I can't even tell you all the different things we can do with all the apps on our phones or on our wrist or whatever. And technology just keeps going by leaps and bounds now. So that is the time period that we're embarking upon, starting into that. So there's so much change happening. Now the prudery or prudeness, it's like morality, I guess, like, very restricted morality, the prudery of the Victorian age. The Victorian age is very much associated with that kind of like, everybody in their place, and we don't talk about, sexual matters. We don't talk about, a lot of sin and things like that. We avoid those things. So that's the stereotype, right, of the Victorian ages. So anyway, the prudery of the Victorian age commingled with the more unbridled feminine constructs of the femme fatale and the new woman, social Darwinism, the white man's burden, fin de siècle. Fin de siècle, that's just a fancy way of saying the end of the century. That's what it's called in French. That's what we often know this time period as, the fin de siècle, or end of the 19th century. invention, industrialization, commercialization, the Gilded Age, the gay 90s, pre-World War I, conspicuous consumption, alienation, social work, impressionism, post-impressionism, art nouveau, segregation, Victorianism, realism, naturalism, regionalism, aestheticism, yeah, I said that right, symbolism, modernism, imperialism, nihilism, evangelicalism, unionism, suffragism, to name a few, produced a culture awash in varying and even contrasting ideologies, both old and new. So some of these terms, let's break them down. I went over them fast. The Gilded Age, it's a term that we use to refer to this time period. Gilded means covered in gold on the outside. So it might not mean everything's well on the inside, but the outside looks shiny and expensive and nice. The Gilded Age, it's covered in gold, right? Like everything's given that beautiful spin. The gay 90s, that's the 1890s. That's the time period leading up to that turn from the 1900s or from the 1800s to the 1900s, the gay 90s. It's known as like this happy time period because, we're approaching that new century and there's a lot of excitement and zeitgeist. Zeitgeist means spirit of the ages. There's a lot of anticipation of what could come, right? So it's this happy-go-lucky gay 90s time period. That's not to say that things weren't going on that were wrong then. There certainly were. Certainly troubles all over the world, everywhere, every time, right? But that is the spin that time period gets. It's pre-World War I, so the suffering of so much of Europe during that war hasn't happened yet. Segregation that was happening, the Civil War has ended, and while Black people are free, right? The enslaved people are free. They're not always being treated the way they should, even though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments give enslaved people the same rights as non-enslaved people. However, women are excluded from those rights, right? All women, white or Black. So supposedly, rights have progressed, right? But there's not always equal treatment. Plessy versus Ferguson, that was a Supreme Court case that happened at the end of the 1800s. Well, they said, separate but equal. We could have separate conditions for Black people and white people, and that will make them equal so that we're not, carrying out the 14th Amendment that allows, equal protection under the law. It's equal if it's separate. But turned around, the Supreme Court turned around and reversed that decision in the 20th century, where they said, you know what? Separate isn't equal because people aren't giving the same funds to support the separate conditions that Black people undergo. They tended to have lesser conditions for schools or water fountains or whatever it was that they had to use that was separate. So there was this idea that separate was equal. And so that led to segregation, right? So even though people had the same rights, we could say, oh, nope, you can't use this. This is just for white people. And the other one for the Black people's over there, and it's not as nice, right? We're not supporting as much. And so thank heavens we reversed that later on in the Supreme Court decision that said separate is not equal. But again, it takes a long time for people to change, attitudes to change. So what is right on paper isn't necessarily what happens in society. Other terms, let's see. We've got, alienation. That's a sense of isolation, right? That kind of set in with the modernity of the early 1900s. Nihilism means a sense of nothingness. That kind of happened when people started challenging beliefs in God, with Darwinism and things like that, and thinkers like Nietzsche. All right, Queen Victoria ended the longest reign of any monarch to that point in England when she died in 1901. She celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, which was a huge celebration of, her long reign. She served 64 years on the throne, and to that point, no other monarch had served that long. She was squarely within our turn of the century period of examination when she died. Quite an incongruous claim to fame for a woman in a country where she, the monarch of the entire British Empire, still could not even cast a single vote in any election. She was the queen, but she couldn't vote. Weird, right? That is that kind of transition. Weird stuff. With Victoria's death and even sometime before it, Victorian restraint and prudery faded. Social convention became less formal, clothing less restrictive, as corsets and hoop skirts were replaced by bustles and later even straighter skirts for women, but they were still wearing skirts. More daring